The small, sunlit town of Fairdale had always felt like a haven to Ethan Daniels. Nestled in the heart of a picturesque valley, it was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other on porches, and the sound of children playing filled the air. Ethan, a 35-year-old architect, had carved out a peaceful life here with his wife, Miranda. Their marriage of 10 years seemed picture-perfect to the outside world. A beautiful home, shared dreams, and the mutual support of a loving couple. But the cracks had started to show long before Ethan could admit it to himself. Ethan leaned back in his office chair, staring at a framed photograph on his desk. In it, Miranda was smiling brightly, her dark hair framing her face as they stood together at the edge of a cliff during their honeymoon in Hawaii. That smile had been his sanctuary, until recently. Lately, Miranda had grown distant. Her phone was always glued to her hand, her laughter reserved for text messages she never shared with him. She began working late, spending weekends away on business retreats, and coming home smelling of expensive cologne that wasn't his. Ethan's stomach churned as the realization dawned. Something was wrong. One evening, as Miranda returned late yet again, Ethan mustered the courage to confront her. "Miranda," he began cautiously, "we need to talk." Miranda's brows knit together, her expression morphing into one of annoyance. "Can this wait, Ethan? I've had a long day." "No," Ethan said firmly, his voice trembling. "I feel like you've been hiding something from me. You're always distant, always on your phone, always." "Stop right there." Miranda cut him off, her voice sharp. "Don't you dare accuse me of anything. Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with your work, I wouldn't have to spend my time elsewhere." Her words felt like a slap to Ethan's face. He tried to defend himself, stammering about his long hours being for their future, but Miranda stormed upstairs, leaving him alone in the deafening silence of their living room. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension. Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut, so he began searching for answers. He scrolled through bank statements and checked social media posts, finding inconsistencies in Miranda's stories. Her so-called business trips coincided with payments to upscale hotels and restaurants he'd never heard of. Then, the confirmation came. A mutual friend, unaware of Ethan's turmoil, casually mentioned seeing Miranda at a cafe, holding hands with another man. Ethan's heart sank. The betrayal was real. But what shook him to his core was how Miranda reacted when he confronted her with the evidence. "You think this is my fault?" she snapped, her face a mask of defiance. "You've been a terrible husband, Ethan. Always working, never here when I needed you." "Of course, I found someone who actually cares about me." Ethan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. Her audacity to blame him for her infidelity ignited a fire within him. "You cheated, Miranda. Don't you dare try to pin this on me." Miranda smirked, her voice dripping with venom. "Let's see if anyone believes you. I'll make sure they see you as the villain, Ethan. You've always been good at playing the victim." Her words weren't just a threat, they were a challenge. As Ethan sat alone that night, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him, a new emotion began to replace his despair, determination. Miranda might try to rewrite the narrative, but Ethan wasn't going to let her get away with it. This wasn't just about saving his reputation. It was about exposing the truth. Ethan spent the next few nights awake, his mind a storm of emotions, hurt, anger, and the unshakable resolve to uncover the full truth. The betrayal had wounded him deeply, but Miranda's audacious attempt to shift the blame onto him lit a fire he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't going to let her lies define his narrative. He started by combing through every detail of their life. Every receipt, every bank statement, every social media post. Miranda had always been meticulous in her actions, but Ethan found patterns that didn't add up. Charges for dinners at exclusive restaurants on nights she claimed to be working late, purchases of luxury items he'd never seen her wear. His breakthrough came when he stumbled upon a hotel booking confirmation in her email. It was for a weekend trip 2 weeks prior, one Miranda had described as a corporate retreat. He recognized the name of the hotel. It was a well-known romantic getaway in a neighboring city. Ethan printed the email and tucked it into a growing folder of evidence. Determined to gather more proof, Ethan enlisted the help of his friend Jake, a private investigator. Jake was a former cop who had left the force to start his own agency, and he was someone Ethan trusted implicitly. When Ethan explained the situation, Jake didn't hesitate. "This isn't just about catching her in the act, Ethan," Jake said as they sipped coffee in Ethan's kitchen. "You need to protect yourself. If she's already blaming you, she might take this further. Be prepared." Jake's words sent a chill down Ethan's spine, but they also strengthened his resolve. Over the next few weeks, Jake shadowed Miranda, documenting her movements. It didn't take long for them to hit pay dirt. One evening, Jake called Ethan. "You're not going to believe this. She's out with the guy right now. I've got photos." Ethan's stomach clenched as he listened to Jake describe the scene. Miranda sitting at an upscale bar, laughing and leaning into a man Ethan had never seen before. The photos Jake sent over were damning. Ethan printed them and added them to the folder. But Miranda's audacity didn't end there. A few days later, Ethan received a notice in the mail. Miranda had filed for divorce, citing emotional neglect and claiming that Ethan's obsessive focus on work had driven her away. The accusations were as false as they were cruel, but they proved that Miranda wasn't going to back down. Ethan knew he needed more than just evidence of her infidelity. He needed to dismantle her narrative entirely. Ethan's lawyer, Karen Hawthorne, was a no-nonsense litigator with a reputation for being relentless in the courtroom. When Ethan laid out the evidence he'd collected, Karen's eyes lit up with determination. "She's trying to paint you as the villain, Ethan," Karen said, flipping through the folder of photos, emails, and receipts. "But these documents tell a completely different story. We'll make sure the court sees the truth." The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Friends, family members, and even casual acquaintances filled the seats, eager to witness the drama unfold. Miranda arrived dressed to the nines, her expression one of cool confidence. She barely glanced at Ethan as she took her seat. Miranda's lawyer began by painting a sympathetic picture of her as a woman who had been emotionally abandoned by a workaholic husband. "My client," the lawyer declared, tried for years to save her marriage. But she was left to feel invisible, neglected, and unloved. Ethan clenched his fists under the table, his anger bubbling just below the surface. Karen placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Let her dig her hole," she whispered. When it was Karen's turn to present their case, she wasted no time dismantling Miranda's narrative. "The plaintiff claims she was emotionally neglected," Karen began, pacing in front of the judge. "But the evidence tells a very different story." Karen displayed the photos Jake had taken, showing Miranda with her lover at the bar, their body language unmistakably intimate. She followed up with the hotel booking confirmation and bank statements showing lavish expenses during Miranda's so-called business trips. Miranda's composure cracked as Karen methodically laid out the evidence. But the most damning moment came when Karen called Jake to the stand. "Mr. Bennett," Karen said, addressing the private investigator, "did you observe the plaintiff engaging in behavior that contradicted her claims of neglect?" Jake nodded. "I did. On multiple occasions, I witnessed the plaintiff with another man. They appeared to be romantically involved." The courtroom murmured, and Miranda's face turned pale. Karen's final blow came when she presented text messages Ethan had recovered from an old phone backup. The messages, between Miranda and her lover, not only confirmed the affair but also revealed their plans to manipulate Ethan into looking like the guilty party. "Your Honor," Karen concluded, her voice steady and resolute, "this isn't just a case of infidelity. This is a calculated attempt to defame my client and rob him of his dignity. The evidence speaks for itself." Ethan glanced at Miranda as Karen spoke. Her confident facade had crumbled entirely. She stared down at the table, avoiding his gaze. The judge called a recess to review the evidence. Ethan stepped outside, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. As he leaned against the courthouse wall, Jake approached him. "You did good in there, Ethan," Jake said. "She might have thought she could twist the truth, but you've got the facts on your side." Ethan nodded, his emotions a whirlwind of relief, anger, and sorrow. This was far from over, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had a fighting chance. Ethan sat back down at the courtroom table, his heart pounding as the judge returned to deliver a preliminary ruling. The room fell silent as the judge glanced over the papers before her, adjusting her glasses. After reviewing the evidence presented thus far, the judge began, her voice firm. It's clear that the plaintiff's claims are contradicted by substantial documentation. This court takes allegations of emotional neglect seriously, but it also demands truth and integrity in such accusations. Counsel for the defense, you may proceed with your final arguments. Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Karen, who nodded confidently. It was time to deliver the final blow to Miranda's deceitful narrative. Karen stepped forward, her posture commanding. Your Honor, and members of the court, she began. My client, Ethan Daniels, has endured months of emotional turmoil, not just from the infidelity of his wife, but from her attempts to destroy his reputation. Today, we've laid bare the truth of her actions, a calculated betrayal followed by a deliberate smear campaign. She gestured to the stack of evidence on the table. Every receipt, photograph, and text message we've presented tells the same story. This was not a marriage destroyed by neglect, but by deceit and selfishness. Miranda's lawyer tried to object, but the judge overruled it, motioning for Karen to continue. We would like to call one final witness to the stand, Karen said, turning toward the door. The door opened, and a man entered, a tall, well-dressed individual Ethan instantly recognized as the man from the photographs. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as he took his place on the witness stand. State your name for the court, Karen instructed. Daniel Carter, the man replied, his voice steady but laced with tension. And your relationship with the plaintiff, Miranda Daniels? Karen asked. Daniel hesitated, his gaze flicking toward Miranda, who glared at him with barely concealed rage. We were romantically involved, he admitted finally. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Ethan's chest tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he listened. Karen nodded. And were you aware that Miranda was married at the time of your relationship? Yes, Daniel replied, his voice barely audible. Karen didn't relent. Did the plaintiff ever discuss plans to shift blame for the breakdown of her marriage onto my client, Mr. Daniels? Daniel's shoulders slumped. He sighed heavily, the weight of the situation visibly wearing on him. Yes, she said. She said she could make it look like it was his fault, that he was controlling and neglectful. She told me she had everything figured out. Miranda shot up from her chair. You liar, she screamed, her voice echoing through the courtroom. This is all your fault, Daniel. Don't you dare turn on me. The judge slammed her gavel. Order. Mrs. Daniels, control yourself, or I will hold you in contempt. Miranda sank back into her seat, her face red with fury, while Daniel looked visibly shaken. Karen turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this testimony, coupled with the overwhelming evidence we've presented, proves beyond any doubt that my client has been the victim of malicious and deceitful actions. We ask that the court not only dismiss the plaintiff's claims, but also consider awarding damages for the emotional and reputational harm inflicted upon my client. The judge nodded thoughtfully. This court will reconvene after a short recess to deliver its ruling. Ethan paced the hallway outside the courtroom, his nerves frayed. Karen stood nearby, reassuring him that they had done everything possible. This is as strong a case as it gets, Ethan. The truth is on your side. When the court reconvened, Ethan's heart raced as the judge addressed the room. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimonies presented, it is the ruling of this court that the plaintiff's claims against Mr. Daniels are without merit. Furthermore, this court finds that the plaintiff acted with malicious intent to defame and manipulate the defendant. As such, the court awards damages to Mr. Daniels for the harm caused by these actions. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him as the gavel struck the block. It was over. Miranda sat frozen, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people began to file out. Ethan turned to Karen, his voice breaking. Thank you. For everything. Karen smiled. You earned this, Ethan. The truth always wins, even when the road to it feels impossible. As Ethan stepped outside, the winter sun hit his face, warming him for the first time in what felt like months. He breathed deeply, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. He had won, not just in court, but in reclaiming his dignity and truth. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed that night, the courtroom victory still sinking in. He had won the battle, but the scars Miranda left behind were far from healed. The betrayal had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront not only her lies, but the pieces of himself that he had lost during their marriage. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of changes. The court ruling granted Ethan the house, clearing him of all financial claims Miranda had tried to make. For her part, Miranda had been ordered to pay restitution for damages, a decision that hit her hard, both financially and socially. Fairdale, once a place where Ethan felt invisible within his routine, now became a source of solace. Neighbors and friends who had heard whispers of the courtroom drama offered him quiet support. There were no grand gestures, just a warm casserole left at his doorstep or a kind word shared during a morning walk. But not everyone was on his side. Miranda's closest friends, the ones who had been complicit in enabling her lies, avoided Ethan like the plague. He heard whispers of how Miranda was spinning the story to save face, painting herself as the victim of a manipulative marriage. But this time, the evidence was too overwhelming for anyone to take her claims seriously. One evening, as Ethan sorted through boxes of old memories, he came across a photo album Miranda had put together years ago. The first page showed a picture from their wedding day. Ethan, beaming in his tuxedo, and Miranda, glowing in her lace gown. He stared at the image for a long moment, memories flooding back, both the good and the bad. Their relationship hadn't always been fraught with deceit. There were moments of genuine happiness, of shared dreams and laughter. But somewhere along the way, the cracks had formed, and they had grown too wide to repair. Ethan closed the album and set it aside, his heart heavy but resolute. It was time to let go of the what-ifs and move forward. A week after the court ruling, Ethan received an unexpected visitor. Daniel Carter, the man who had been Miranda's lover, stood on his porch, looking nervous but determined. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his tone wary. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I came to apologize," he said, "for everything. I didn't know how much damage Miranda was causing. When she told me about you, she made it seem like you were the problem. I believed her, and I'm sorry." Ethan studied Daniel for a moment, his emotions conflicted. Part of him wanted to slam the door, but another part recognized the sincerity in Daniel's voice. "You were a part of it," Ethan said evenly. "But she made her choices, just like you did. I'm not interested in holding on to this anymore." Daniel nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you. I hope you find peace." As Daniel walked away, Ethan closed the door and leaned against it. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but holding on to anger wouldn't help him heal. In the months that followed, Ethan focused on rebuilding his life. He threw himself into his work, taking on projects that reignited his passion for architecture. He began reconnecting with old friends, rediscovering the joy of companionship without the weight of Miranda's manipulation. Therapy became a cornerstone of his healing journey. Talking through his experiences with a compassionate counselor helped him process the betrayal and rebuild his self-esteem. One day, while jogging through Fairdale's Central Park, Ethan paused to take in the view of the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. He realized how far he had come, not just in exposing Miranda's lies, but in reclaiming his own sense of worth. Ethan knew he wasn't fully healed yet, but he was on the right path. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. Meanwhile, Miranda's life took a different trajectory. The court ruling had tarnished her reputation, and her social circle had begun to distance themselves. She was forced to sell her designer belongings to cover the restitution payments, and her attempts to reinvent herself fell flat. Ethan occasionally heard about her through mutual acquaintances, but he no longer felt the sting of her name. She was a chapter in his life, one he had closed. 6 months after the trial, Ethan found himself at a local cafe, sketching designs for a new project. The place was lively, filled with the chatter of people and the hum of coffee machines. "Excuse me," a voice said, breaking his focus. Ethan looked up to see a woman about his age, her warm smile framed by auburn curls. "Are you using this chair?" she asked, motioning to the seat across from him. "No, go ahead," Ethan replied, returning her smile. As she sat down, She glanced at his sketches. Those are amazing. Are you an architect? Ethan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, I am. I'm Lily, she said, extending her hand. Ethan, he replied, shaking it. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that, even after the storm, life could still offer new beginnings. Ethan stood in front of the nearly completed building, the crisp morning air carrying the faint scent of fresh paint and sawdust. The project had consumed him for months, but in the best way possible. It was his first major endeavor since the court case, a sleek community center designed to bring people together. As he ran his hand along the polished railing of the entryway, Ethan reflected on how far he had come. The man who had felt shattered by betrayal was no more. In his place stood someone who had faced pain, rebuilt himself, and emerged stronger. Life didn't magically fix itself after the court case. The first few months had been a roller coaster of emotions: relief at being vindicated, anger at what he had endured, and uncertainty about how to move forward. Therapy remained a constant in Ethan's journey. His counselor, Dr. Mills, helped him unpack not only the betrayal but the underlying patterns in his marriage. You've been carrying the weight of someone else's choices for too long, Dr. Mills said during one session. It's time to focus on your own story, on what you want your life to look like. Ethan took those words to heart. He started journaling, capturing his thoughts, fears, and dreams. It wasn't easy to revisit the darkest moments, but the process was cathartic. Each page he filled felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. He also began embracing new opportunities. Invitations from friends he had once distanced himself from were now met with enthusiasm. He joined a local hiking group, rediscovered his love for photography, and even started volunteering at a youth mentorship program. One day, while leading a group of students through a design workshop at the community center, Ethan spotted Lily, the woman he had met at the cafe months ago. She was standing near the entrance, chatting with one of the volunteers. Their paths had crossed several times since their first meeting, and each interaction had been natural, unforced. Lily was witty, compassionate, and refreshingly straightforward, qualities Ethan hadn't realized he missed in a partner. "Hey, stranger," she said with a grin as she approached. "I didn't know you were running this place." "I designed it," Ethan said, feeling a surge of pride. "It's kind of my baby." "Well, it's beautiful. You should be proud," Lily said, her eyes sparkling. They spent the afternoon working together, and by the end of the day, Ethan found himself asking her to dinner. She accepted with a smile that left him feeling lighter than he had in years. Despite the new beginnings, Ethan knew there was one last piece of the past he needed to address. A few weeks later, he sat down to write Miranda a letter, not to rekindle anything, but to finally close the door on their chapter. In the letter, Ethan expressed his feelings honestly. He acknowledged the pain she had caused, but also thanked her for the lessons he had learned. "You taught me the value of resilience," he wrote. "I've realized that forgiveness isn't about excusing what you did. It's about freeing myself from it. I wish you peace, Miranda, and I hope you find a way to be honest with yourself." Ethan never sent the letter. Instead, he folded it neatly and tucked it into the back of his journal. Writing it had been enough. Months turned into a year, and the shadows of the past began to fade. Ethan and Lily grew closer, their relationship built on mutual respect and honesty. One evening, as they sat by the lake watching the sunset, Lily turned to Ethan. "You've been through so much, and yet here you are, kind, grounded, and open. How did you do it?" Ethan thought for a moment, the light of the setting sun casting golden hues on the water. "I guess I realized that life isn't about avoiding pain. It's about what you do with it. I could have let it break me, but instead, I chose to rebuild." Lily smiled, her hand finding his. "You're amazing, Ethan. I hope you know that." For the first time in years, Ethan didn't doubt the words. He had come full circle, not just surviving the storm but thriving in its aftermath. Ethan often thought back to the darkest days of his life, not with bitterness, but with gratitude for how far he had come. The experience had stripped him bare, forcing him to confront his deepest fears and vulnerabilities. But it had also shown him the strength he didn't know he possessed. He had learned to trust again, to embrace new possibilities, and to let go of the anger and pain that had once consumed him. As he looked out over the bustling community center one sunny afternoon, watching children play and families gather, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The scars of the past were still there, faint reminders of what he had endured, but they no longer defined him. They were simply part of his story, a story of resilience, growth, and the power of choosing to move forward.